All right. So, what trigger hormones to be released? Well, there are three stimuli for hormone release. It can be neural, it can be humoral, or hormonal. So, we will take one at a time. We will start by looking at neural stimuli first. Now, some axons of neurons, their synaptic terminals are found embedded in a gland, and that gland is an extension of the nervous system. So, what does that mean? In this picture, you see the adrenal gland, and the picture also shows nerves terminating in the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal medulla is technically an extension of the nervous system, and when these nerves release their neurotransmitters, the neurotransmitters are dumped straight into the bloodstream. That means the neurotransmitters are acting as a chemical signal in the blood, which is technically a hormone. And the best example of this are epinephrine, oxytocin, and antidiuretic hormone or ADH. Okay, so one more time, we see that the adrenal medulla is stimulated by the axon is stimulated by the nerve coming from the nervous system, and in response to the nervous stimulation, the adrenal medulla releases hormones that are dumped into the bloodstream. Okay, moving on to the second type of stimuli of endocrine glands, which is humoral. So, now some hormones are triggered for release because there is something in the blood, some sort of chemical that is being monitored, or when the compound or substance gets too low, then hormones are released so that the substance build back up and accumulate in the blood. What does that mean? So, in this case, the secretion of hormones depends on changing blood levels of some ions or nutrients. For example, there is calcium in blood, right? We know that calcium ions are transported via blood. Now, if blood calcium levels drop, that sends a stimuli to the parathyroid gland to secrete parathyroid hormones. And the parathyroid hormones work on specific organs of the body to release more calcium into the blood. So the calcium level in blood comes back to normal. So that's humoral stimuli, where a particular hormone is released due to fluctuations in some ions or nutrients in the blood, and release of parathyroid hormones from the parathyroid glands are a classic example of this. The last one is hormonal stimuli, which is so in this case we see that hormones are released in response to other hormones produced by other endocrine glands. So here in the picture we do see the hypothalamus shaded in blue. The hypothalamus releases some hormones that come and target the pituitary gland. In response to that, the pituitary gland releases other hormones which then targets particular glands or organs. And in response to that, the target glands or organs releases other hormones. So we have hormones released from the pituitary gland. The hormones released from the hypothalamus coming to the pituitary, causing the pituitary to release other hormones which target these glands. And in response to that, these glands release other hormones. So we do see a cascade effect here. This is hormonal stimuli. Okay, now let's start talking about the pituitary gland. So we will start talking about the anatomy and see how the hypothalamus controls secretion of pituitary hormones. So in this picture, this area is the hypothalamus, and this big gland here is a pituitary gland. Now the pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by this stalk. Do you see the stalk here? The stalk is called infundibulum. Okay, now the pituitary is divided into two lobes. This right here, all this is the anterior lobe, and all this is the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is also called adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called neurohypophysis. The anterior lobe has two parts. The bigger part is called pars distalis, which is this big part here. And then the smaller part is called pars tuberalis, which is this. I should change color. Okay. So the anterior lobe has this structure called pars tuberalis, and this bigger structure is pars distalis. The posterior lobe is actually an extension of the hypothalamus. So the posterior lobe is also made up of nervous tissue, and that is why it's called pars nervosa. Now for testing purpose, you do not have to memorize pars distalis, pars tuberalis, or pars nervosa. So don't worry about these terms. Don't worry. Okay? All right. Now, the question is, how does hypothalamus control the endocrine system? I want you to remember one very important thing, and that is the hypothalamus is the CEO of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is the master regulator. So the hypothalamus is the master regulator of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus controls the endocrine system by three main ways. First, the hypothalamus produces some regulatory hormones, so the regulatory hormones, I'll just write RH here. The regulatory hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and they travel to the anterior pituitary. And in response to those regulatory hormones, the anterior pituitary releases a bunch of other hormones, which we will look at in the next slide. Okay, so that's regulation number one. The second regulation is the hypothalamus produces two hormones. These are ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. These two hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, and then they are transported by axons of some neurons. So they are actually, let's not go into those details. So know that ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, and they are transported and stored in the posterior pituitary. And then by appropriate stimuli, the posterior pituitary releases ADH and oxytocin into the blood. So know that ADH and oxytocin are produced in the hypothalamus, and they are stored in the posterior pituitary for future release. That's regulation number two. The third control or third regulation is that you should already know this from your anatomy class, that the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. It's also the CEO of the autonomic nervous system. And the hypothalamus stimulates hormone secretion of the adrenal medulla via sympathetic innervation. So the hypothalamus controls secretion of the adrenal medulla, which is this inner part, by sympathetic innervation. So these are the three regulations. Regulatory hormones targeting the anterior pituitary, causing it to release other hormones. Production of ADH and oxytocin by the hypothalamus, which then are stored in the posterior pituitary and released into bloodstream via appropriate stimulation. And then also the hypothalamus controls hormonal release from the adrenal medulla via the sympathetic pathway. Okay? All right. Now the question is, okay, we just talked about the regulatory hormones, right, that are produced in the hypothalamus, and then those hormones target the anterior pituitary. But the question is, how do these hormones, these regulatory hormones, travel from the hypothalamus all the way to the anterior pituitary? How do they travel? To understand that, we have to understand something called portal system. Let's talk about that. So this is a picture that I usually draw on the whiteboard in class. Since we are doing it all online, I just drew it out for you. So what is a portal system? A portal system is made up of two capillary beds in tandem. So here we have one capillary bed. We have capillary bed number 1, and we also have capillary bed number 2. And these two capillary beds are connected by a portal vessel. This is called a portal system. If you are taking physio with me, you should know that there are 3 portal systems in the body. One that we will study right now, called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. The second one is actually in the kidney. And then the third one is the hepatic portal system of the the hepatic portal system of the liver. So there are 3 portal systems in the body, and we will look at one today. So here, right here, what do we see? We do see the hypothalamus, we see the infundibulum, we also see the pituitary gland, right? Now this right here is the first capillary bed of the portal system, and this capillary bed is the primary plexus. Now there are these veins, do you see? These are called hypophyseal veins, and these are called hypophyseal portal veins. So these are portal veins that connect to the second capillary bed here, which is called secondary plexus. So the idea is we have capillary bed number 1, capillary bed number 2, connected by these portal vessels. And this portal system is called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Really important, because the regulatory hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, they are dumped into the first capillary bed, and then via the portal veins they are transported to the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the regulatory hormones reach the anterior pituitary via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. I'll stop here and then start with another video.